back on the Zero Hour. I'm your host, Richard RJ Eskow. I always enjoy talking with my next guest. It seems that he often has a new book out, as well as excellent perspectives on what's going on in this country and abroad from a historical perspective. And he does indeed have a new book out, although it's a reissue. Harvey Kaye is a historian and a professor emeritus of democracy and justice studies at the University of Wisconsin in Green Bay. As I say, he's the author of a number of books, the latest of which is a new edition of, if you're watching on YouTube or Free Speech TV, this object I hold in my hands, The British Marxist Historians by Harvey J. Kaye. And without any further ado, Harvey, welcome back to the program.
Thank you. It's great. And as I said to you before we started up, this is the first of my interviews on the British Marxist historians. And I'm going to add a little spin to that. Since this book goes back 40 years in the making, when I first wrote it, my very first book, in fact, at that time, there was no internet. There was no opportunity to promote it other than by way of, well, there were lots of book reviews and stuff like that, but there really wasn't much of a chance to speak to folks unless I was out giving a talk. So this is kind of exciting. And there's that line, everything old is new again, you might say.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, the other thing about 40 years ago, Harvey Kaye, is that a book with the word Marxist in the title might not have been received as open-mindedly. I mean, a certain crowd, certainly, academic crowds, certainly, but a lot of people might have a reflexive response to that word in the title, don't you think?
Yeah, and not surprisingly, the original publisher was a press that is now absorbed into a much larger corporate order, Basil Blackwell, the Polity Press imprint of Basil Blackwell, which was headquartered in Oxford, England. And the British had tremendous interest in these kinds of things. The Americans were interested, but in certain circles. I'll just notice, I can't help but note, the first major review the book received, however, was by what was then the queen of neoconservatives, Gertrude Himmelfarb, in the pages of the New Republic. And there were mistakes there. And I remember saying to the head of the imprint, who I contacted back in Oxford, and I said, should I answer? No. You got a review in the New Republic from the right, which is generally favorable. Celebrate. So
yeah, well, let's talk a little bit then about the subject matter itself. First of all, as Harvey, as you know, I contacted you with some excitement when I had not seen the book in its first edition. When I learned a new edition was coming out on the British Marxist Historians, I got all excited because the ones you cover, and in your initial book, and I know you added a couple chapters later, which are here, but it was Eric Hobsbawm, Christopher Hill, E.P. Thompson, and so on. And so I think in this book it comes to 6 altogether. But first of all, I didn't realize that they were a school of historians. I'll just admit that right now. But I was an enormous fan of their individual works, most of them anyway. And I didn't have the time to really go through my library. But, for those who are watching on video again, my well-worn edition of The Age of Revolution, 1789 to 1848 by E.J. Hobsbawm, Eric Hobsbawm. And this book, The World Turned Upside Down by Christopher Hill, in the last couple years, I've reread it a couple times, and if you doubt that, you can look at all the stickies that are in it, thousands of different colors chosen at random.
Man after my own heart, yes.
Yeah, and by the way, as a completist on this subject, there are also stickies in your book. So I got very excited because these were people that many years ago really shaped and reshaped my thinking about history by the way they approached it, by, yes, they are a group that cohered around Marxism, and as you note, they were members of the British Communist Party at one point, but really their outlook is, you don't have to be doctrinaire or anything to understand. This is me talking. Obviously, you're the one who knows. But my impression is you don't have to be doctrinaire or anything in order to understand that what they did by shifting the focus of history was really important for anyone who cares about social or economic justice. Is it a fair statement?
Yes. And I'll say that without reservation, their work, along with that of a couple of American historians, Eugene Genovese, who wrote on slavery, though he became a arch conservative in his last years alive, and also somewhat younger Eric Foner. These were the historians who literally shaped the thinking and the work of my generation. Those of us who came through as undergraduates, maybe in the 60s, and in my case, graduate studies in the 70s. But I will tell you what's really curious. I think I know I wrote about it in the preface, both prefaces. I didn't start out with an interest in British history. I didn't even start out with an interest in American history. I started out as a Latin Americanist, but I was so frustrated by the ways in which American historians and social scientists were analyzing landlord and peasant relations in Latin America. My focus was Hispanic America, from Mexico down to Chile, that I really went looking for an alternative way of understanding what I thought of as the really important question of struggles between landlords and peasants. And it was by way of Eugene Genovese's writing on slavery. And I could spend literally 45 minutes talking about how I came to write this book. But it was Genovese who I asked some critical questions, and he said, you need to read the British historians. And I did after I had read all of Genovese's work. And it was really in the late 70s, after I had the PhD, though their influence is in my dissertation, that I really sort of turned to them. And there's a whole host of very serendipitous stories that occurred that led me to write about them. But really one of the things, and I'll just point this out, one of the things that really pushed me to write about them on a larger basis in an article or a set of talks was that my generation of historians, folks who in the late 70s would have been approaching 30 years of age, they were literally attacking the generation before them, that British Marxist generation. I used to tell people it was kind of Freudian, these, the youngsters trying to kill off their fathers to get access to the Cleo the Muse. It was that kind of thing.
It's interesting. Yeah.
And by the way, and curiously enough, and I had exchanges with them, but I became friends with some of them. In fact, one of whom I've just recently reestablished contact, a Scottish historian. But the point is that I was really pissed off about the ways in which the debate was taking place. And I knew I had to intervene. And as a consequence, I took up the project, got a book contract in, again, a serendipitous fashion, and went on to write. And then in the course of writing the book, came to know them by way of interviews. And later, especially after the book appeared, became very good friends and close friends with several of them. And it really just changed everything. And a last note on that is that they were saying to me in the late 80s, after the book had come out, you shouldn't be writing about us anymore, number one. And number two, you shouldn't even be writing about Britain. You should be writing about America. You should take this question of class struggle into the American context. And so I ended up writing about Thomas Paine and eventually from there, labor, and you know the rest.
Yes, I do. And FDR and other issues as well.
Right.
So, but really, so the through line here in your career, whether it's Britain or the United States or Latin America, is power relationships and the people, as well as, sort of meta level exploration, examination of the people who study or attempt to alter power relationships. That's how it sounds to me. That going from the British Marxist historians, for example, to Thomas Paine, to me, is a journey of this is how four people tried to reevaluate, deconstruct and reconstruct the history of their own country in a new way. Going from that to Thomas Paine is here's somebody who, coming from Britain to the United States, really radically wanted to redefine the relationships between the rulers and the ruled.
Yeah, and it's also, and I should point out, without going too far into Thomas Paine necessarily, a major part of Edward Thompson's book, The Making of the English Working Class, is actually framed by Thomas Paine's work, The Rights of Man. And what's notable is The Rights of Man, which came out in the early 1790s in response to situation in Britain and the revolution in France, was itself inspired by the American Revolution that he had been so central to helping to incite. And what he learned about the possible making of democracy in America, he then took and literally informed a generation of English artisans and, sort of tradesmen. So there's this sort of dialectic across the Atlantic that takes place. And I think because of that is what Thompson kept saying, you should really be writing about Paine's influence and those kinds of things. I mean, it's all, I look back on it now, all these many years later, and I see a story inside my life, which may be my invention, but nevertheless.
Well, Kierkegaard said life can only be understood backwards, but it has to be lived forwards. And
that's the opening quote of my dissertation.
Oh, really? Okay. Well, that's become my mantra, but
sorry, I took us away.
No, that's okay. Of the historians, I mean, I think it's fair to say that, and you describe this in the book, that they came to their various approaches to history, some with some overlaps and some different focuses, through for ideological or idealistic reasons, right? I mean, they were clearly scholars, in that they weren't going to let their ideology dictate their discovery or their learning, but they, in common, appeared to believe that there were certain or understudied aspects of their own country's history, right?
Yeah, there were three figures who shaped their work in England. Their work together, notably, they were in university in the 30s. Their university studies were broken up because of the beginnings of World War II. Most of them served in the British Army during the war. A couple who I haven't written about at length there, but wrote about later and got very close to, served in certain domestic capacities like fire service and whatever. But the thing is, there were three figures who, after the war, really influenced what was known as the Communist Party Historians Group, which was very active from about 46, 47 up until 1956. There was a woman named Donna Torr, who, in spite of her being a very staunch communist, was very much of her own she had her own approach to history. And that had to do with this idea of history from the bottom up. And she would say that we have to rewrite the history so that the hand of the worker has a place in that history. And then there was Leslie Morton, known as A.L. Morton, who was very interested in what was called in England people's history, which had a longer tradition. And he put together a book decidedly within the purview of the English Communist Party, the British Communist Party, which lays out a new story, a narrative of England, which is dated by the time I approached it, but it shaped a couple of generations of young British Marxists. And the third figure here, who I include as one of the key figures in this group, though he was a bit older than the rest, was Maurice Dobb, who was an economist and economic historian at Cambridge University, who was part of that same cohort, you might say, as Keynes, for example, who was at Cambridge, if I'm not mistaken. And Joan Robinson may well also have been there. I mean, it was this sort of cohort that he was part of. But he was the Marxist, the communist, and he wrote a book called Studies in the Development of Capitalism, which really threw down the gauntlet against the likes of Max Weber's Protestant ethic, Henri Perrin's argument about capitalism originating in long-distance trade. And his argument really was an argument that to understand the making of capitalism, you have to understand the class struggles that empowered it. And these historians basically took from those three seniors these kinds of ideas and then cultivated it in a kind of division of labor. There was Rodney Hilton, who worked on medieval studies and the peasantry, Christopher Hill, who literally turned the 17th century history of England into a story of the English Revolution, in which you could say the English taught the French how to take off the head of a king. And and basically people came to see the 17th century, whether or not they fully accepted Hill's arguments, as Hill's century. And then you get Eric Hobsbawm, who really a kind of universal historian. He wrote on British labor history. He wrote on social bandits and peasant struggles around the world. He wrote phenomenal. Well, you had The Age of Revolution in your hand a little while ago. A phenomenal. He set out to write 3 volumes on the history of the long 19th century. And then there's a whole story we could take up or not about how he ended up writing about the 20th century as well. Right. And then you get E.P. Thompson, who really became the hero of my generation regarding historical studies, who, I mean, it's a very tough book to work through because it's 900 pages long, The Making of the English Working Class. And for Americans who don't know English history, and I did not when I first took it up, it can be a slog. But if you go into it and say to yourself, Thompson originally wanted to be a poet, and you think of some of his paragraphs in poetic form, it takes on a whole new life, and I think it makes it easier for the reader to grasp. Anyhow, so these historians, and then others who I write about in ensuing work, but are included as references there, they really did, by changing the writing of English history, and also Hobsbawm's ability to write world history, shaped a generation. And by the way, not only my generation, and because what's interesting, when that book came out, translations have appeared in Spanish, in Japanese. There was a pirated Chinese edition, and a Turkish edition of all things. Strangely enough, I kept hoping the French would translate it, but maybe they were too anti-British to do that.
They may have been, but my personal exposure, and by the way, you mentioned the one of the books I did find but forgot to bring in was Primitive Rebels by this fascination on Hobsbawm's part about people. It's almost I'm getting a little digression, but it feels almost proto-anarchist as in his.
For sure, yes.
That he's really talking about groups of various kinds, from the origins of the mafia to other different kinds of spontaneously formed rebel groups of various kinds, and their development.
Yeah, and in fact, historically, your reference is actually perfect, because the two Mediterranean nations where anarchism really took hold were, as a consequence, in sort of peasant communities in Italy and Spain. And it clearly must have been rooted in the older social banditry and primitive rebellions.
Right, absolutely. And I guess but in general, when I think of the 3, I wouldn't claim to know any of them well. That would be presumptuous. And it's been a while since I've read, most of what I've read, with the exception of Hill. But when I think of them, and your book sort of affirmed this for me. When I think, for example, of Eric Hobsbawm, I think of this sort of encyclopedic gatherer and organizer and orchestrator of data. I mean, he can make tables of household size and income relative to this and that in these neighborhoods of London, and yet at the same time get the big picture, the sweep. So he has this fascinating eyeglasses with one microscopic lens and one big lens. That's my take on him. Christopher Hill, it seems to me, of the 4 you describe and of the ones I know best, he's almost the dreamer to me. My impression of Christopher Hill, again, as you say, he wrote about the 17th century in England, English Civil War during that time, profusion of different movements, both political, religious. He's almost, first of all, a magpie to me. He collects all these amazing. This book has got so many tags in it. It's not always easygoing. The world turned upside down, which, by the way, the title was made into a folk song about the Diggers. You probably know that. People would recognize the phrase "all things in common" from that. It begins in 1649, I think, on St. George's Hill. A ragged group they call the Diggers came to work the people's will, or something like that. And obviously, of course, inspired by the book. But two things about it. Again, there's this micro macro diversion. He throws in so much information. There'll be a passage about, and then the mechanical preachers were, speaking in the Oxfordshire countryside. And they go, wait a minute, what's a mechanical preacher? And I'll look it up on the internet. There'll be nothing. And then 4 chapters later, he has a chapter on mechanical preachers, but I still don't know exactly what, I think I know it. But so he's got this like profusion of information, which is why I have so many tags in this one. And yet underlying theme of him seems to me, as opposed to, let's say, Thompson and I'm sorry for talking so much, I want to lay this up for you.
It's okay.
As opposed to Thompson and Hobsbawm, who I think are like taking the box apart like a kid and they go, how did this thing, capitalism, who built it? How's it put together? With Christopher Hill, it almost seems like, the John Lennon song Imagine, like he's saying, look, these movements almost prevailed, which I'm sure is an intense debate around that idea, but that they could have, and we might have had a very different England and therefore a very different Western world than we have. And I'll just close by saying one of the reasons why I reread something like Christopher Hill is because I think this is a good time to think about alternative social and political dynamics in societies. But I think he's got this very idealistic, we might have had a proto-communistic, proto-mystical / atheist England. I'm not sure that's true, but are my impressions more or less right, you think?
I love that impression, because I have to tell you, it just kicked off this reminder that I hope I get to speak of at various times. Each one of the historians daubed a separate. I never actually got to meet him. I didn't realize when I was working on the book that he was still alive. It's my stupidity, and I should have realized it. But Rodney Hilton himself, now he was the medievalist.
Right.
Anyone who knows medieval history knows it really is the most detective-like activity. You have to really look for pieces of evidence in diverse places. And his favorite art form was the detective mystery.
Oh, that's interesting.
The mystery writer. And he was very pissed off with me when I told him I never read detective novels. And he couldn't believe that he was really ready to write me off completely. Christopher Hill clearly was enamored with literature and poetry. It's Milton and Bunyan were central to his work. In fact, later, when he really did turn more and more to literary kinds of things. And then in the case of Thompson, it's literally William Morris, okay? And I will tell you that when I would ask Thompson about Hill's work, it was clear that the man whose work he was most admirous of, and they were good friends, was Christopher Hill's. And it's notable that the making of the English working class, and speaking of poetry, I believe opens with reference, I'm forgetting all of a sudden the poet, but it opens with reference to poetry and closes with reference to poetry. And Thompson himself, if he could have had his way, if he had been born not simply to a family of some importance, but truly a wealthy family, which I don't believe they were, he would have just spent his life as a poet. He and his older brother would have spent their lives as poets. And in fact, his older brother was killed during the war working with the partisans. He was parachuted in as part of the Special Operations Europe, and Edward idolized him, really. But they each have this, I think you're right about Hill, but I would add that each of them had this art form that struck them. And finally, I should point out, Hobsbawm spent many years writing jazz criticism.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, under a pseudonym. He wrote it for the New Statesman, the magazine in England. Later, they were brought together and his name was actually put on the volume of collected work. Yeah, they embarrassed me, the four of them. Victor Kiernan, another member of the group, two of the figures who I came to know as well and wrote about and edited their works for them were Victor Kiernan and George Rude. And Kiernan once said to me, I asked him one time about his views of philosophy, and he said, everything a philosopher has written can be summarized in all the philosophers together, we can summarize in half a page, other than maybe Marx. He said, it's literature. Every historian must read literature. I remember I said to him one time, I have to confess, I only read literature when I have to work on a historical period. And he said, Harvey, a historian without literature is like a man without a shadow.
Oh, that's a beautiful line. That's a line, right? Of somebody who appreciates literature. All of them, Hill in particular, but they seem to love the gems, the quotes, the excerpts, the clips, and Hill seems to me to be, and I'm sorry, I hate if we're losing anyone with this, but I'm enjoying it so much that Hill seems to me to be the mystic of the group too, that he seems to have an attraction to, not that he's irrational, but that he has an attraction to the madness as well as the political ideology, perhaps more than the others.
That could well be. And I will tell you that I tweeted yesterday a picture of Christopher Hill and Bridget Hill. His wife Bridget worked on 18th century women's history, a picture from 1985, with my two daughters. No, it would have been later, a few years later, but with both of my daughters when they were very little. And the pictures, two of these pictures have Christopher actually looks like he could be Merlin, for what it's worth.
I'm not surprised. Yeah,
striking. I'll send you the picture so you'll know.
Please do. Yeah, and I think one of the reasons why I love reading this stuff, and I think others should as well. I mean, I'm not going to tell people what to love, but why a lot of people might is that there's so many aha moments in it. Plus, just then there are just so many fascinating facts that kind of alter your mind, or fine-tune your mind a little bit when you absorb them, as well as quotes, as well as the poetry and the literature of the information itself. But
let me drop one more story. I have to drop one more story, which you will have read in the new preface, because for anyone who picks up the book, you'll see. And then my new preface, the third preface to the book, I recount some moments that I had with each of the historians. When I contacted them as I was beginning to write the book, the one who I thought I would immediately have hoped I would immediately have contact with, and I had assumed we would connect, was Eric Hobsbawm. I figured we shared certain things. First of all, we were both from a Jewish background. Secondly, he did work on Latin America, which was my field. I forget the third, but the point was there were these things. And Hill, and Thompson were very welcoming and happy to invite me to meet when I came over to England. But Hobsbawm wrote and said, "Oh, no." He said, we ought not to meet. You should basically, I'm paraphrasing, you should treat me like Frederick Jackson Turner. If people don't realize that was the historian of the American frontier, and his argument about the frontier is the source of American sort of democracy and individualism. But the point is that Hobsbawm basically said, you want to treat me like that. You don't want me running around. You want to treat me as if I'm dead. And, and we had no contact until after the book came out. And a few years later, his two closest friends of the group were Victor Kiernan and George Rude, whom I had gotten close to. And they told him, you have to contact Harvey. You want to get to know him. And that's when we met up. And he was the last of the group to pass away, 95 years of age, and we stayed in contact pretty much to the very end. He really was a brilliant universal mind, and there were times when I was with him that I literally listened closely and walked away almost remembering nothing. I was so fascinated by the kinds of things revealing to me. Right.
And it's been a delight to see Hobsbawm discovered by a younger generation of writers, of a lot of people online. There's an active online left and young socialist community. They've all embraced him, perhaps a little less so the others. And
today I think you're right. I think that's the case.
And I'd like to see, one of my hopes is that they also embrace the others who have so much to offer. But I guess, as we approach the end of our conversation, Harvey, Kaye, what would you say to somebody, progressive, voracious reader? Why would this book be of interest to them?
Okay, that I really do think this is the reason. I mean, look, first of all, because they are a school of history, they have shaped a generation of history. But let me put it in contemporary political terms. Why should their work of the 60s and the 70s, and even the work going back to the 40s, all the way through the 80s into the 90s, why would that make a difference to us? Especially for people who aren't historians. And I'll tell you why. One of the things that they shared was a commitment to revealing the ways in which class struggle has shaped history. Now, that they didn't argue that classes shaped history. They argued that class struggle shaped history. Their point was that even when it seemed that the classic image of a working class or the classic image of the bourgeoisie wasn't quite there, the point was to show the degree to which the struggle itself went on. Now, we live at a time, we've gone through 45 years, you've heard me say this many times, of class war from above.
Right.
And we have yet to see, and it's only now recently that we've begun to see a kind of reemergence, if you like, of a working class sort of momentum and dynamic. But that didn't mean it wasn't there all the other decades.
Right.
From the 70s to the present. The struggles were taking place, but they were very effectively contained, submerged. The point is, the struggles often took the form of resistance. And I will point out, and they really influenced my thinking ever since. I remember reading in the 80s when it seemed like the labor movement was smashed, that the fastest growing expenditure by capital was on security. Okay, whether it was warehouse security or basically in the factory security, and it wasn't just security as in possible crime from the outside. It also had to do with surveillance. Surveillance was intensifying. Why? Because they knew the struggle continued, and we often forget that. Okay. And the point is that those of us who think we're so smart because we have university degrees and we think of ourselves as intellectuals, even Marx said, even the educators needed to be educated. The struggle is going on out there. It's our task to engage it, not to try to run it.
Right. Well, and I can't resist pointing out then that, in the book you talk about the fact that there was some debate among them about could you characterize certain conflicts in British history as quote unquote class conflict if people weren't aware that they belonged to a class, if they didn't have, what's called class consciousness? Could you still be documenting class struggle? And the conclusion seems to be yes. And I think that's also very relevant for today, because to me, I think we see a reforming class consciousness in the young union movement and that type of thing. Mm-hmm. But we also see a lot of people kind of analogous to, Hobsbawm's primitive rebels or other analogies. They may not see themselves as part of a class struggle or a class movement, but, quiet quitting, as it's so called, or the fact that people are walking off lousy jobs or whatever have you, or maybe even some forms of vandalism or theft, whatever, that there are elements of conflict and struggle that by understanding the past in this way, we can hopefully understand the present.
Right. And I want to add that, look, I've argued for years that the Democratic Party is afraid of working people and the working class. They're just afraid of them. So as a consequence, they've turned their backs on them, not only because they owe their donors a certain kind of certain kind of politics, but also because they just do not want to tap into the spirit that working people might have for actually rescuing and enhancing democracy.
Right. You got to trust democracy in order to turn the country over to the people. So, well, on that note, again, let me grab it. The book is The British Marxist Historians by Harvey J. Kaye. It's out on the Zero Books Press. I recommend it. There it is. We both have it here. So if you're watching,
For historical purposes, in case they find it in a used bookstore, though the first edition is pricey these days. That was the original cover in 1980, winter of 84, 85.
So go economical and get the new one.
Right.
And on that note, Harvey J. Kaye, historian and professor emeritus at the University of Wisconsin, Green Bay. As always, great talking with you. And as always, thanks for coming on the program.
Thank you. I'm all the more enthused. You can hear it in my voice.
Good. I'm glad to hear it. We'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.